I've been doing research about future automated mobilities since around 2014 now, which seems a really long time. I've been doing research about many other things at the same time, so I haven't exclusively dedicated myself to that. And much of that research has been undertaken in Sweden. There have been several reasons for that. I mean, partly because there has been so much enthusiasm for that area in Sweden. There's been funding for that area of research in Sweden. And also because the group of researchers I work with at Halmstad University and Volvo Cars is a research group that we've kind of formed across academia and industry, and we've been working together for a long time and formed some really strong relationships there. During that period, we've worked across at least 4 government-funded and industry-partnered projects, looking at self-driving cars and most recently at mobility as a service. And I'm going to be talking about some of that work, but I'm also going to be, at the end, I'll talk a little bit about future work as well, because I'm also the leader of the Transport Mobilities Focus Area for the Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society. That's an Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence. And there we've also got some plans to develop more work about future automated mobilities initially in Australia. And I'll speak a little bit about that as we go on. I think as Anthony said, I'm director of the Emerging Technologies Research Lab. So my interest in future automated mobilities is core to that work, but my work is more broadly about emerging technologies. And I wanted to also mention, why I'm fascinated by emerging technologies, because I'm interested in questions about how technologies emerge into uncertain futures. So it's part of a wider research trajectory where I found myself doing a lot of research about digital technologies in everyday life. And I started to realize that maybe I wanted to stop thinking about the digital and to start thinking about emerging technologies and actually how we were going to start to move forward with technology into future worlds, but into future worlds that are uncertain and worlds that we can't really predict. And I think the current moment, even though we knew that already, most of us as social scientists knew that we couldn't predict what was going to happen next. I think the current moment has made that absolutely clear. And I hope that will be a jolt for our social science disciplines into pushing us to actually change our focus and shift our focus away from around what's already happened, what might be happening in the moment, to actually think a lot more seriously about what a future-focused social science can look like. I know some of us are doing that already, but I think there needs to be a wider movement towards shifting the social sciences, and in doing so, shifting the relevance of the social sciences and enabling us to play in that space where engineering, business and organisation studies and economics and all of those disciplines that actually, design in particular, that very unproblematically think about futures as part of their research scope and their interventional scope. So I think we're actually at a really important moment where we can think differently, and we really ought to. I'll talk about some of that a bit more right at the end of the talk. And I mean, in terms of the theoretical ideas I work with processual theories of possibility and emergence, which really underpin the design anthropological approach that I work with. And I also work with anticipatory concepts, and I think the level of the concept, and I'll talk about that before one of the key aspects of my talk actually, the level of the concept as opposed to the level of the ground theory is really important in terms of thinking about how the social sciences can become involved in these areas which are interdisciplinary, which require us to be both theoretical and applied. I see theoretical scholarship and applied research in the social sciences as necessarily being part of the same agenda, feeding into each other and really nurturing each other and enabling us to move on. And there are a set of anticipatory concepts that I work with across different projects, and some of which I've worked with more and some of which I will be working with more in the future. But I feel that these concepts actually also enable us to understand the idea of moving forward into futures experientially. And those are trust, anxiety, hope, and desire. Now, here I'm going to be focusing on the concept of trust, because that's one which we've worked on a lot across a series of projects, and we've done that in ways that are quite interventional as well. Now, in the area of future mobilities, I think my core interest really relates to what Anthony was talking about at the end when he's talking about the most recent interest of the networks as well. I'm interested in how automated and human ways of knowing, sensing, and decision making might best be brought together. And by best, I mean, how might they be brought together to forge ethical, responsible futures? I think there's also a key thing there as well, which is about thinking about how those futures might also modes of thinking that are open, flexible, and adaptable, and how we actually integrate those questions into a technology design as well. Again, going back to the current moment. If we're faced with a moment of crisis, a moment where we have to change rapidly, not just in terms of future mobility, but also in terms of other areas I work in. So last night I was giving a talk in the UK about the way that social workers have started to use digital technologies during the COVID-19 pandemic, when they can't work as normal. The same principle applies. How might we actually design technologies and processes and systems, as well as automated future systems, that enable us to adapt very rapidly into unknown and uncertain futures? How can we actually start thinking about that, thinking in that way, rather than thinking in terms of technological solutions that solve problems in ways that are fixed? It's also about thinking about the product differently, as a product as open and ongoing, rather than the product as something we finish and launch into a market. So many ways in which those ideas are engaging with the contemporary innovation paradigms and narratives in ways that I hope will be disruptive, and which I hope will enable us to actually think differently. So, before I ramble on too much, I want to share my screen and introduce you to my PowerPoint presentation. Okay, I think for me also one of the really kind of exciting aspects of emerging technologies is that they're always talked about as if they're kind of at the cusp of launching into new markets and new worlds. Emerging technologies are always nearly there. And that's the other kind of very interesting aspect of emerging technologies for me. And they're not always nearly there. They're also on the cusp of having a major societal impact. And for me, that's another kind of really fascinating point. And I'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. What I want to do now is just to start to give you a taster of some of the interests I have in self-driving cars and autonomous driving vehicles. So this is the vision of what an autonomous driving vehicle is meant to be like in the future. And part of my agenda is not so much as developing a social science critique, even though I could and other people have, of future visions. It's actually because myself and my colleagues work in this area where we actually want to work with stakeholders from the public sector and from industry. And I want to also think of the idea of moving the social sciences away from critique towards collaboration and participation, which is also part of my agenda for a future-focused social science. I want to think about the idea of complicating. So how can the social sciences play a role in complicating future visions, making the gaps in them evident and working towards new and different, more open future visions. So this article is actually an article. This image isn't one that Volvo Cars gave us permission to use, in an article that I wrote with one of my colleagues from Volvo and one of my colleagues from Halmstad University. And the reason why we wanted to use this image, which is for the future self-driving car, is because we were really starting to wonder, based on our ethnographic research, where we did kind of research about what people's existing cars really look like, what they actually have in their cars, and also how they mapped out all of those things that they needed to take with them in their cars. We were just really wondering how future self-driving cars would be able to look so nice and so clean, and how we would make that seamless transition into a lovely, nice, clean self-driving car for business meetings, whereas actually people's real cars are full of loads and loads of stuff. So for me, this question of complicating is really about bringing some of those realities into future visions, about thinking about how plausible some of those clean-cut future visions really are. Now, before talking about some more of the details of that, I want to do a bit of a backtrack to talk again a little bit about emerging technologies and why I'm so fascinated also in transport mobilities and transport mobility technologies as emerging technologies. The first one is to think a little bit about the electric car. The electric car is fascinating because it's been an emerging transport technology for a very long time, actually. For me, electric, once I started to research the history of the electric vehicle, I was fascinated. It's been an emerging technology for over 100 years. Think of electric vehicles as being they're actually kind of apparently at another pivotal moment at the moment where they're probably just about to, generate large markets. Although, maybe it will be hydrogen instead. We don't know. But the first electric vehicles have actually come about in the late 19th century. And up to the 1980s, around the 70s and 80s, there's some fantastic YouTube videos actually of people testing and talking about electric vehicles, which I won't have time to show, but I would love to. But they've also fascinating because they've attracted quite a lot of academic interest as well, mainly because the French sociologist Calonne in the 1980s developed a sociological reading of electric vehicles as a sociological controversy, showing that the engineers of electric vehicles actually took on two different kind of theories. And according to Calonne, it was actually Bourdieu's theory, which was the one that kind of predominated in this debate amongst the engineers, whereby EVs didn't actually generate a market. But what I think is fascinating about EVs, is they've stayed in this moment of kind of gradually, kind of potentially generating a market. And in industry and policy narratives, they tend to be framed as part of a solution for a world that needs to transition to sustainable energy, but is held back by barriers to consumers' uptake. And that's what KPMG had to say about it in 2018. I think it's really fascinating. What's really fascinating is that we have emerging technologies which are really ready to go, but there are always barriers. And the barriers are usually the very people who are meant to take them up and who are ultimately meant to benefit from them. Now, the barriers, one of the most fascinating barriers is what's been called range anxiety. It's a key barrier. And the range anxiety is what I think is an engineer's imaginary about kind of every day being worried about the range, the distance which their electric vehicle can cover. When you look at all of the ethnographic research about electric vehicles, you find that actually most people who have electric vehicles and use them don't actually range as a barrier because they conceptualize electric vehicles as being used for something other than long distance. So this has kind of led me to think about something like range anxiety is actually not necessarily a barrier at all, because it doesn't necessarily even exist in the way in which it's conceptualized as existing, but an enormous amount of research in technology design has been funded to actually remove this barrier. So if range anxiety wasn't the barrier, then something might have been going wrong there in terms of the innovation paradigm. Now, that's a whole other story, and I won't go into that argument in any more detail, but what I want to highlight is that actually in 2019 automated decision making has been seen as removing other barriers in terms of the uptake of electric vehicles, and I'll come back to that later right at the end of my talk when I talk a bit more about automated decision making. But what we start to see is this narrative of as a vision where we have supposed barriers and supposed solution barriers coming on in a kind of cyclical way where we just kind of keep going. And we still don't really know if electric vehicles are going to become ubiquitous in our markets. Now, what about self-driving cars? Well, self-driving cars are actually equally fascinating in terms of being an emerging technology. There's a slightly shorter history, although they have been part of the popular imagination for many years. So AD cars are the most hyped emerging technology in 2015, according to Fortune magazine. And at that time, they were predicted to be on the roads by 2020. And actually, that goes along with our narrative of research with Volvo cars. We thought we were going to be doing ethnographic research in self-driving cars as they went around the road that kind of forms a ring around Gothenburg before then. as part of a project, which we did participate in, and we worked with cars that had many self-driving features. But the car companies generally in the industry and policy makers started to realise soon that this wouldn't happen. Now, Anthony was talking a bit about some of the kind of benefits that are claimed for self-driving cars. And yes, you know, the claims are that they'll eliminate human error, increasing road safety. They'll improve quality of life by freeing up driving time for infotainment or work. I think, yeah, our research has shown that people do many things in the car already, as Anthony said too. That they'll decrease carbon emissions and increase energy efficiency. And in Australia, it's also been hoped that they'll reinvigorate the automotive and related service industries. Now, interestingly, in 2017, the Australian government commissioned a report which emphasised the importance of public engagement in building acceptance of driverless vehicles. So the point was that we need to get people to accept driverless vehicles so that we can actually get these benefits. Now, I think the thing about acceptance is that in the technology design narratives that try to design technology so that people will accept them, trust is seen as one of the main steps in the process of acceptance, which is important to keep in mind because I'll come back to trust in a bit. In 2017 also, the UCL Transport Institute for the London Department of Transport also did some work asking what will consumers accept and what will they require in order to feel that they trust the technology. So again, we see the barrier becomes trust. We need people to trust self-driving cars so that they'll accept them. So trust actually becomes really central in this. In 2018, I actually declined to be part of an EUH 2020 funding application that we got to a second round for, because it was so bought into this innovation narrative. This funding call actually listed amongst the expected impacts of projects for AD vehicles that they would contribute to a better user acceptance of innovative, cooperative, connected and highly automated transport systems. So we see that, you know, internationally and also supporting major funding initiatives, the idea that we need to get passive consumers or people, users, to accept self-driving cars is really, really dominant. But, you know, there's a bit of a problem here. I mean, in 2019, the American Automobile Association's annual automated vehicle survey still reported that 71% of Americans were afraid to ride in fully autonomous driving vehicles. And only 1 in 5 were comfortable with them transporting loved ones. So there's a lot of kind of impetus towards hoping that, you know, people will trust and accept autonomous driving vehicles, but a lot of the surveys are suggesting that they won't. So in 2020, 5 years after AD cars were the most hyped emerging technology, they remained part of our predicted futures as one of the 7 biggest technology trends that must be prepared for. So we can kind of see this trajectory of an emerging technology continuing. Now, some of the latest developments in AD technology still make the tech news. And I've been kind of monitoring these in 2020 as we go along. And they include kind of new questions about how they will be used to transport people and things, including the first and last mile, which is actually one of our key interests in a Mobilities as a Service project I'm involved in, and also how they'll be used in regional distance travel. We now have predictions that they'll be on the roads in 2030, but that perhaps AD trucks are going to be on the roads much sooner. So I found this story about how autonomous driving cars are kind of evolving as an emerging technology, but they don't actually stop being an emerging technology. And it looks like they're set to continue to be one until 2030 now. It's actually really fascinating. And it's a fascinating example of how the kind of innovation paradigm is very bought into this process of a problem and a solution, whereby in the end, the solutions will kind of come about, and the vehicles that we imagine as part of our futures, in forms similar to the forms that are at the moment, will actually become ubiquitous in our societies. I kind of think we need to start thinking about futures a bit differently, and I will talk about that more as I go on as well. Now, the next emerging technology then I want to talk about is mobility as a service. Mobility as a service is different kind of type of emerging technology to talk about, because it's not a vehicle like an electric vehicle or an autonomous driving vehicle. It's a system. So it's quite a different kind of thing in a way. And it's the kind of thing that actually autonomous driving vehicles and electric vehicles and a multitude of other things could potentially become part of. The image here is actually of something that could be a component of future mobility system, and it's a car share and commute journey map that we've used in workshops based on our research. But let's look at mobility as a service as an emerging technology. So it kind of represents a future intelligent transport system which will integrate different modes of transport, and it will seek to create potentially seamless, effective and sustainable multimodal mobility solutions. Now, it's increasingly become regarded as a new way to confront the opportunities and challenges of future mobilities in an era of artificial intelligence and automated decision making. And it's also attracted growing attention and research funding recently. I'm actually involved in 2 mobility funded projects in Sweden about mobility as a service. And I have 2 PhD students doing research about mobility as a service, and I'll also be thinking about this in my future projects in Australia. But although mobility as a service has attracted so much attention and funding, and interest, it actually doesn't exist. Similarly to autonomous driving cars, some mobility as a service experiments and features are currently available, but it's not actually really out there either. So is it yet another emerging technology actually at the cusp of becoming a reality, something that we need to work on so that it can be acceptable to people, so that people will trust it, people will use it, and we will get the benefits from it. So Australian and UK academic research reveals concerns about public and private collaboration and the commercialisation of individual travel through mobility as a service. So some of the key things that I've noticed coming through in the research I've been reviewing have been focused on questions of how mobility as a service can actually become a viable reality if we have competing interests from industry and the public sector in terms of public transport and private transport systems. How can they effectively be brought together? How can we avoid or support the commercialisation of individual travel through mobility as a service? The academic arguments are, of course, that we need to avoid its commercialisation, although other sectors, of course, are seeking to find the best way to commercialise it. In Sweden, it's also been argued that we really need to align societal and key mobility as a service stakeholder goals. How do we align the governmental organisations, the public and private transport companies and the startups? How can we actually bring them all together to have shared goals for mobility as a service? But one of the really fascinating things, similarly to electric vehicles and autonomous driving vehicles often as well, is that people don't really seem to be accounted for in any of these reviews and discussions and visions of future mobility as a service. Well, they're accounted for in particular ways, but in Sweden, which I thought was super interesting, a study which had been based on workshops and interviews of stakeholders from the public and private sectors involved with mobility as a service actually revealed that the participants in these interviews did not profess much knowledge about end users, and they saw the need for further pilots to learn more about users' attitudes, preferences and behaviours. I should say that both of the mobility as a service projects that I'm involved in Sweden are multi-stakeholder projects. I'll talk about them more later, and they both have a strong design ethnography component in which we are accounting for people very, very thoroughly and using our insights from people to complicate some of these existing narratives. But I just found this so fascinating because mobility as a service has been conceptualised. It's being promoted as being on the cusp of becoming a reality and this kind of pivotal, potentially future ubiquitous system. But, you know, the people involved in it really don't know that much about the potential end users of it. So there's a lot of work here for us as social scientists. Now, before I know that a lot of this talk is kind of focused on these kind of stakeholder questions, stakeholder questions and the applied aspect of the work, I wanted to quickly introduce some of my interests as an academic. A lot of my work involves design anthropology now. The Design Anthropological Futures book is not actually my book. It's a book that's edited by people who I know and whose work I really admire, and also Rachel Charlotte Smith, who is one of the co-investigators on one of the projects I'm involved in Sweden. Another piece of work that I've been involved in a lot is the work of trying to shift anthropology into a future-focused discipline. This book, Anthropologies and Futures, really does outline that agenda and really calls for a new and radically different anthropology. My work on uncertainty and possibility has been at the interface of anthropology and design, has involved mainly collaborating with Yoko Okama, who is an amazing designer at RMIT University, where we've really been also trying to think about how we can blend practice from different disciplines and push that forward in such a way that we can think about futures experimentally, but in terms of opening up thought about futures as being open, as being non-predictive, and as being things that we really need to start to investigate in new ways and in interdisciplinary ways, and in which we actually blend the practice of ethnography design, and in my work also documentary filmmaking. Now, I'd love to have questions about that later, but I want to kind of continue now to talk about the concepts which we've been working with in our projects in Sweden and in other projects, particularly the concept of trust, which has also emerged in the work that I just showed in the other slide. I think trust has been brought up in all of the projects I worked on in recent years by industry partners and external non-academic stakeholders. Very much concerned with the question of how will people trust new digital and emerging technologies, how will people trust new interfaces, and really seeing trust as one of those key kind of problems and questions which needed to be rethought in a digital and emerging technology context. For me, trust is an anticipatory concept. Trust is one of those, is about that feeling that we have as we're about to move on into our futures, to take that next step over. Now, that next step over isn't voluntary, actually, because we're always going to be moving on into the future. We can't stop the world here and say, I'm not moving on into the future because I don't feel comfortable. So trust is not just about moving on, it's about moving on in a particular way. It's about moving on, feeling confident, comfortable, and familiar. It's about knowing enough about what we think might be about to happen next to have those feelings. So I see trust as a feeling, as something we sense in our bodies, as an affective and sensory quality of the way that we necessarily need to move forward in the world. I see trust in that sense as different. It's different for me to the way in which trust is conceptualized in some other disciplines, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But I want to also just note two other concepts. Sharing, which I highlighted in my abstract. I won't talk about sharing today, but I'm happy to kind of open up to that in the questions. And there isn't enough time to focus on both of them. But sharing is another key concept that's been very evident, particularly as mobility as a service has started to become a bigger question for industry and policymakers. And personalisation, which I will talk about briefly, because personalisation has become actually absolutely core to the way that emerging technologies are being thought of, not only in terms of future mobilities and mobility as a service, but also in terms of future smart homes and other areas that I work in. So let's move on to trust. Now, this slide is actually of is one of a series of cards that we made from one of our self-driving car projects in order to communicate our findings in disruptive ways. The key thing about this card is actually to bring forth the sense of the idea of trust as a feeling. And we have a quote from a participant who kind of says, you know, once it feels like it's able to take decisions and handle situations, trust for me. The core thing is about trust being actually a feeling. It's the way that he actually felt in the self-driving car, rather than a kind of interactional or transactional relationship with the car or with the interface of the car. So trust. Now, as I said before, trust has been one of the fundamental concerns for stakeholders in nearly all my projects. It's usually seen as a key challenge or barrier to technology acceptance. It's been hoped, as I noted before, that AD benefits will accrue if the public trust and accept new technologies. It can be explored from different disciplinary perspectives, which makes it really kind of important as what I would call a container concept, where I can actually talk to people from other disciplines because they also use the concept of trust, even though they might use it in different ways. It's frequently investigated through large-scale surveys or quantitative testing. So the consultancies like KPMG, Deloitte, etc., they very often do big trust surveys. Human-computer interaction designers very often do quantitative testing around the way that people might trust their interactions with technologies in controlled settings, and they measure levels of trust. Now, as I said before, for me as a design anthropologist, trust is actually something quite different. It's an anticipatory concept that enables a future focus, because it enables me to actually study how people move forward and how they feel as they move forward in their engagement with technologies in particular circumstances. For me, why trust? Because I think trust is actually a key concept through which we can complicate the narrative. We can complicate that idea that we can actually get people to trust technologies and they will then accept them because they've trusted them, and then they will adopt them, and then those technologies will become ubiquitous in society, and then we will accrue all of the benefits that those technologies promise to bring. So how do we complicate the narrative? Well, and what narratives do I want to complicate? Well, first, human-computer interaction research has a focus on how to design technologies that individuals will trust and accept. There's a model called the technology acceptance model that depends on trust within that discipline. It focuses on people as users, and users as that kind of category of person that will ultimately trust a technology and use it. Now, organisations are much more interested in the trust of consumers. The consumer is that individual who will consume and purchase the technology. Now, in policy, we get much more interest in the trust of public citizens. Now, in design anthropology, we're much more interested in a different category of individual. We're interested in people. And actually, within the Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision-Making Society, I'm one of the leaders of the People programme. We don't think about users, citizens or consumers. We think about people and their complex lives. There's also a key people project, a European-funded people project I've been engaged with to a certain extent, which is also similarly moving away from the idea of users, consumers, citizens or publics, but actually focused on people. People have complex lives. People are much more than users of technologies who become engaged in the interaction with the technology. People are much more than consumers who might purchase technologies or engage with organisations. People are not just citizens. People are not just part of publics. People have very complex lives, and people complicate the innovation narratives that focus on users, consumers and publics and citizens, because they actually have complicated lives, and their lives complicate what they can do. People actually live in contingent circumstances, do things we don't expect they're going to do. They also improvise and innovate to create solutions to those contingent circumstances. So when we think about trust, we actually want to think about trust as situated, as sensed, and as ongoingly emergent within the complex lives of people. It doesn't just happen in terms of an interaction with a technology, a self-driving car, electric vehicle, or a mobility as a service interface. It actually happens in situations that can be quite complex and difficult. And that's exactly what we want to investigate. We actually get into people's lives, we get into people's cars with them, we get into people's homes with them. I video record and talk to people as they drive me along in their cars. I interrogate what they have in their cars and what that actually makes them feel in terms of what's going on in their cars. We try to complicate the narrative. So what's happening here then is that we will drive along in this guy, Hocken's car, and as an anthropologist, I was super interested in the materiality of his car. So I started to ask him what was going on there. So it turns out that he's got this thing just hanging there from one of the controls from his steering wheel, this toy. Trust was one of the kind of questions in this project. So I said, you know what, what's that? What's going on there? What's that toy hanging there? And this launched this amazing long story from Håkon about what was going on in his car. Now, he told us that this toy had actually been something that he'd picked up when he'd been at a fast food restaurant with his kids when they'd been on a long trip. And the toy, they'd picked it up, and one of his kids, one of his sons, had really, really loved it. So they just kept it there in the car. That day, though, when they were driving along at night, his son had actually become ill afterwards. And they were pretty worried about him, and they realised they really needed to get him some medical attention. So they had to drive through the night from their holiday base to get him medical attention. And as they were driving through the night, he was driving along, and he had this toy there in his car. And he drove through the night. And in Sweden, it's very significant what happened, because he drove along, and it was quite a bright night, and he saw a dark shadow pass behind his car. Now, in Sweden, if you see a big shadow pass behind your car as you've driven at night, you know you've been super lucky, because that would have been a moose or a big animal, which potentially, had he had the accident with that animal, it could have been a very dangerous accident, and also his son would not have got to the medical attention they were seeking for him. So he realised they'd been really, really lucky. And so the drama of this kind of compelling moment meant that he associated that luck and that sense of being fortunate with having the toy in the car. And he kind of concluded this story by saying, yeah, I always keep this in my car because I really trust it. For him, having the toy in the car was what he trusted. Which is not to say that he trusts the toy in an interaction or transactional way. It's to say that the reason why we trust it, we feel comfortable, we feel familiar, we feel confident, is because we actually have a sense of the circumstances for which we're in as being right for us. We don't trust in the car because it's been designed in such a way that we'll trust in an interface. We trust because of the circumstances in which we're in. It's not a rational feeling. It's actually to do with the contingent circumstances in which we're in at any one moment. And that takes me back to this picture which we saw earlier. We did quite a lot of work around the mess and stuff that people kept in their cars, but one particular participant was super interesting. This participant called Anneli showed Thomas, one of our key researchers who I'll mention later, what she kept in her car. There was a fire extinguisher, snow, shovel, candles, blankets, and ice. She said to him, and here is two of them because I'm a safety addict. One extra large first aid kit with candles, jump cables, and all of them. Some of it was from the insurance company as well that had given her everything. She says, because I've chosen to have so much stuff in the car, it gets difficult to use this, showing her the space under the luggage compartment floor. So she had so many things in her car. And the key thing was that she felt safe because... And she trusted her car. She trusted to be able to go out in her car because she had so many things in her car that she believed would keep her safe in the event of something happening. Not because she particularly trusted in the technology. She trusted in the circumstances she had created to make herself feel safe. Also, the fact that people keep so many things in their car impacts on future visions of car sharing as well, in mobility as a service and other sharing scenarios. But that's another story that we follow up in our work in a different direction. I'll just remind you of this drawing of, we did these with many participants, what people keep in their cars. This is what cars are really like. Okay, so that's the work we've been doing about how people drive in the present and what the implications might be for how people might trust new technologies and what people might want to have around them in the future and what they might actually trust in, what circumstances, what materialities, what feelings they might trust in. But doing research about future automobilities also has a massive challenge in that we're doing research about technologies that don't exist. And I've emphasised so many times that they're not ubiquitous, they're not on our roads, we don't even necessarily know what they are yet. So how can we research them in ways that give us a sense of what the future might feel like? I've stressed the importance of feelings, of those sensory environments, those materialities, as where we move in terms of what we sense and feel. How can we actually understand those when things that we're trying to research don't exist at all? Well, that's one of the reasons I think for us work on Volvo Cars has just been so fortunate, because we've been doing a lot of research in car tests and trials. Now, this picture is one I often put up on a screen and ask people to guess what it is. I won't do that now, but I will say that the reason why I love doing that, because it isn't what it seems. It's actually, so all of the images, the shop fronts look like they're from the US. And then we've got streets and there's cars around in some of the renderings of this as well. And then we've got the Swedish woods in the background. So this is a car test site with pretend shop fronts. As you can see, when you look at it from above, there's nothing inside there. Where a lot of Wizard of Oz testing is done. Now, Wizard of Oz cars, if people don't know, are simulated kind of test cars, in our case, simulated self-driving cars that research participants actually drive in, and they believe at the time that they are actually travelling in cars that are driving themselves. So the cars should have a safety driver. Sometimes they are used on those test sites, sometimes on real roads. So what that has actually made possible for us as social scientists is to be able to do research about people as they experience situations that they cannot really experience in everyday life. Sometimes in test situations, but sometimes in everyday life scenarios. Now that, for an anthropologist, is just really transgressing the limits of my discipline as it's traditionally formulated, and I think it's been absolutely fantastic. We've actually been able to learn how people feel, what their sensory and emotional experiences of being in cars they think are self-driving cars were. So we've accompanied them on some of these trips and interviewed them afterwards, also interviewed them during those experiences as well. So part of that research was taken place in kind of car testing processes where we've been looking at people experiencing different degrees of automation in test sites. But part of it has been part of this project called the DriveMe project. DriveMe is a wider Volvo Cars project in which 5 families were given a Volvo XC90 car with a number of high-level driving assistance systems to use for a period of 1.5 years on an everyday basis. So during that process, they accumulated experience of the car and they developed routines of using it in their everyday lives. So this was a very kind of high-level self-driving car, up to the point where those were able to go on the roads. They were able to go on the road time. Now, this is super interesting because the early stages of our study with these families actually suggested that participants generated these feelings of trust and confidence in the automated features of the car, that they were contingent on very specific circumstances and that they weren't constant. So what we learned from this project is that, and we've got, I won't go into the examples because I don't want to talk for too long, but I can just mentioning a few cases, is that what we found was that people felt that they trusted particular stretches of road, particular traffic situations. They felt trust and confidence in the situation they were in the car. But in other stretches of road, in other situations, they didn't feel that they trusted the car and they felt that they would like it to be different. They would like to take over or do things differently themselves. So what we found then is that people didn't just trust the technology. They actually trusted in the way that technology and people and situations and the environment configured in particular circumstances during particular moments in a journey. Now, this is really interesting because, again, it really contradicts this idea that you can design technologies that people trust in. It actually opens up the question of if we should be creating technologies that are open enough for people to be able to create circumstances that they feel confident in relation to those technologies as they drive and engage with those technologies. So moving again to this idea then of trust as a disruptive concept then. What this work has enabled us to do is to actually intervene in these categories that are already engaged in technology design and in industry and policy narratives. And trust is a great concept to use for this because what we're trying to do in our work is to rethink trust qualitatively. We want to rethink it, not as something that's an interactional engagement, but something that's an emerging element of ongoing circumstances. It's not about an interaction. It's not about a transactional relationship, as it's often thought of in many areas. It can't remain fixed. You don't just start trusting a technology, then you trust it. Actually, you trust in a situation, and the technology that situation is involved in is part of it, but you might not always trust in the situation that technology is in. So it's very contingent. And people, because people aren't consistent, what people feel and what people think and what people do is always contingent. People are what complicate the predictive futures of these innovation paradigms that suggest that we can actually get people to trust the technology, accept it, and then accrue the benefits of it. So rather than focus on trust, then we might want to focus on something else. We might want to ask the question of how technology might be designed in such a way to enable people to create situations in which they have a sense of trust. That's a rather different technology design process. It creates a different relationship with the social sciences as well. The implication is then that we need a more open way of thinking about both technology design and futures. We need to be flexible, we need to be adaptable, we need to be prepared for rapid shifts into new modes in times of crisis. And I think we know that more than ever now. So going back to our cards, our card deck that we actually designed for Selfdriving Futures card deck, our insight was that trust is contextual. It shapes the autonomous driving experience in multiple ways, develops differently in different contexts. It's actually a way of actively knowing. It's tacit, it's unspoken, it's connected to transparency, communication, familiarity, confidence, and sensation. It's a much deeper, richer concept than had been assumed. So I'm just going to skim over stuff now because I want some time for discussion. But what have we done since then? So we've carried that work through into subsequent projects. We have our Future Urban Mobilities website, which is based on our Human Approach project, where we've used those cards, and we've also kind of moved on in other ways to thinking about designing future cities and intelligent cars. So we started to work not just with Volvo Cars, but also with city partners in Helsingborg and Gothenburg to create meeting points between our stakeholders and actually ask them to confront that challenge related to the private and public sector interests and stakeholder interests in mobility as a service, to actually think about how we might move on together, but by putting people at the centre to complicate the narratives of industry and policy. We've come up with some really great results by actually bringing together all of those different fields to co-create prototypes of future systems and services. Here are our design cards that we've used in that. We've also used videos of people driving and showing what that's really like. It's a free app. We've asked people to complicate those journey maps like the one I showed to represent mobility as a service with post-its and alternative, realistic, plausible futures. So we've really tried to push that on in new ways. And also we now have our AHA 2 project was funded, where we're actually taking that project to another level with new partners, and we're working with new prototypes in cities at the moment. Although they are, because I'm not in Sweden. I'm trying to participate at distance. So a little bit of an acknowledgement here. The research partners and funders who have supported our work, and also to point out that I'm presenting this work right now, but I did not do any of this alone or myself. I did it as one person within a very big team. And this is a group of our team coming from Volvo Cars, from the cities, from the different universities as Chos, Sweden, Denmark, and Australia. A lot of people need to be involved to do this much work. But I want to just quickly say something about what's happening next in Australia as well. So I mentioned the Transport Mobilities focus area of the Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making in Society. The first project I'm going to be pushing forward through this, one of several projects, but the important kind of big key one for me is one called Future Automated Mobilities, Imaginaries and Possibilities for a World in Crisis. And what I want the project to do is to really determine how future automated futures of transport mobilities are being reimagined in post-COVID-19 and post-bushfire crisis across industry policy making and everyday life. I want us to investigate what can be done to design differently so we don't replicate this innovation problem solution paradigm when we think about automated decision making in future mobilities. I want to really develop some more interventional and interdisciplinary approaches for this, and also to put ethics, responsibility and benefits to people at the core of the work. Now, the work focuses on automated decision making, so a specific aspect of automated future mobilities. But that's the core of what we're going to be doing next in that work. And also, there's a key problem that comes into this, which is the problem or the promise of personalisation, because I said I'd come back to automated decision making and electric vehicles. And in a 2019 World Economic Forum report, it was suggested that automated decision making would satisfy the individual preferences of EV owners and prevent congestion by creating an agile market for electricity using a combination of dynamic pricing, remote control of charging ability, all facilitated by an automated machine learning decision assistant. So there are two things here. One is personalisation, individual preferences of EV owners. It's about the individual and personalising their routes. And it's about automation. I think the second point I want to make is a recent McKinsey & Co report that I've looked at this year, where it suggested that personalisation is the future of not only auto retail, but also retail as a whole. Leveraging of big data, incredible stitching together of data about customers will be the future of the car buying experience. Now, personalisation and the car buying experience, one of my colleagues, Thomas Lindgren, whose work is absolutely brilliant, has actually looked at the anticipatory modes of the Tesla buying experience. And again, what his work shows, and which highlights the focus on the individual, on personalisation, and the lack of attention to the social, which is exemplified in both of these future predictions, is that Tesla buying experience is very much of that happens actually in terms of an anticipatory experience that happens in the forums where the future Tesla owners talk to the current Tesla owners and actually generate up an amazing community of kind of solidarity and communication. The social's lost in all of these. So this is just my final slide, and it's a slide that I kind of often use to communicate to interdisciplinary and multi-stakeholder audiences to try and show where I am and the work that I'm advocating is, which is in the middle. In the middle, working with people with complex everyday lives, looking at non-predictive qualitative futures through design ethnography and ethnographic insights and materials. So on the one side, it moves away from what I kind of what I was doing as an academic, I think, in the past, and what some academics are still doing, which is actually creating academic research, knowledge, theory, the bigger comparative picture, but a bit worried about discussing futures because they haven't really been on our radar in the social sciences because they're so problematic, and we've often problematized other people's visions of futures so much. But on the other hand, and working with research participants, on the other side are the stakeholders, industry, technology, design, policy, cities and consumer associations, where quantitative future predictions have been so predominant and where people have tended to be seen as users, consumers and citizens. So my point is not to critique those two other sides, but it's about complicating some of the ways in which thinking is developed in those different areas and bringing us together in the middle to see how we can really benefit from and learn from each other's work, but also modify and seed to other disciplines. Because I know as a social scientist, I do have to give away some of my basic critical principles. As an anthropologist, I was taught to criticize everything and think that everybody was wrong as soon as I looked at it. And that's something I've definitely moved away from. To be open, not only about futures, but also to be open about what other disciplines and stakeholders want and think, and to realise that others are not wrong. They have different what ifs, and we need to let them complicate our own ideas as well. Okay, then, so that's my end. I'm back to Paddington Station because I wanted to bring a bit of history and a bit of the present and wonder what that might be like in the future as well.